One child grew up believing their father was a hero, only to discover he was responsible for unimaginable horrors. Another spent decades defending a man the world condemned, refusing to accept the truth. But not all of them followed their parents' footsteps. Some broke free, rejected their family's past, and dedicated their lives to making amends. Today we're uncovering the untold stories of what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after World War II. Some Nazi leaders' children rejected their parents' past. Gudrun Himmler did the opposite. Born in 1929, she was the only daughter of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, and one of the men behind the Holocaust. Unlike others who distanced themselves, she spent her entire life defending him. During the war, Gudrun lived in luxury. Her father adored her, calling her Puppy, Daddy's little doll, and giving her everything she wanted. He even arranged for her to fly to Berlin from Munich just to spend time with him. At 12 years old, she visited Dachau concentration camp, writing in her diary about the pretty gardens, unaware of the horrors inside. After Germany lost the war, Gudrun and her mother were captured by American forces and held in prison camps across Europe. They were even taken to Nuremberg, where she saw her father's closest allies on trial. But instead of questioning what her father had done, she doubled down. For decades, Gudrun worked with Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, an underground group that helped former SS officers escape justice. She supported war criminals including Klaus Barbie, a Nazi responsible for mass torture, and Anton Meloth, an SS guard who murdered prisoners. Unlike others who changed their names, Gudrun kept hers proudly. She never admitted her father's guilt and stayed involved in far-right groups until her death in 2018. Next is Niklas Frank, the son who hated his father. While Gudrun Himmler defended her father, Niklas Frank despised his. His father, Hans Frank, was Hitler's personal lawyer and governor general of occupied Poland, where millions were murdered or starved. He was so brutal he was called the Butcher of Poland. Niklas grew up in wealth, unaware of what was happening outside his home. But as he got older and learned the truth, he hated everything his father stood for. Unlike many Nazi children who stayed silent, Niklas spoke out. He wrote books, gave speeches, and publicly condemned his father. His book, The Shadow of the Reich, was a direct attack on his father's crimes. He even said he was glad when his father was executed at Nuremberg in 1946. Niklas also criticized post-war Germany, saying the country never fully took responsibility for the Holocaust. He accused Germans of trying to forget their past instead of facing it. His hatred ran deep, so deep that he even wrote a play where he imagined digging up to his father's body and forcing him to confess. Not everyone supported him. Some thought he was obsessed with guilt, while others said he just wanted attention. But Niklas didn't care. He believed it was his duty to make sure history was never forgotten. Even today, he remains one of the most outspoken voices against Nazi Germany's legacy. Next up is Etta Goring, who was born into unimaginable privilege. As the only daughter of Hermann Goring, one of Hitler's top commanders, she grew up in Karenhall, a massive estate filled with stolen artwork, gold, and treasures looted from Nazi-occupied Europe. Her father was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Germany, and he spoiled her with extravagant gifts, rare paintings, jewelry, even furniture taken from the homes of people who had been deported to concentration camps. She was surrounded by Nazi officials and treated like royalty, with Hitler himself as her godfather. While the war raged on and millions suffered, Etta lived in a bubble. She never experienced rationing, bombings, or the fear that gripped ordinary German families. Everything changed, though, when Germany lost the war. As the Allies closed in, Hermann Göring moved his family to the Bavarian Alps, hoping to negotiate a surrender that would allow him to keep his power. That didn't happen. He was captured, put on trial at Nuremberg, and sentenced to death for war crimes. Before he could be hanged, though, he took a cyanide pill and died by suicide. Etta was just 8 years old when her father died, and from that moment on, she and her mother Emmy Goring, were left to fend for themselves. They were held in American custody for months, then released with no money, no property, and no allies. But even with everything that had happened, Etta never condemned her father. She spoke about him with love and admiration, calling him a kind and generous man. She refused to acknowledge his role in the Holocaust, insisting he had been misunderstood. Even decades later, she fought to reclaim family property that had been confiscated after the war, including stolen artwork. In 2015, she petitioned the Bavarian government to return assets from her father's estate. The response? A unanimous rejection. She passed away in 2018, still defending the man history remembers as one of Hitler's closest allies. But this next one wanted redemption. Monika Hertwig grew up believing a lie. Her father, Amon Goth, was one of the most ruthless Nazi officers of the Holocaust. He ran the Plaszow concentration camp, where he personally executed prisoners, sometimes shooting them from his balcony for sport. His cruelty was so extreme that even some Nazis thought he was too brutal. But Monika's mother, Ruth Irene Calder, never told her the truth. Instead, she painted Amon Goth as a hero, a loving man who had been unfairly accused after the war. For years, Monika believed her father was a good man. Then, in 1993, she saw Schindler's List. She sat in the theater watching Ralph Fiennes' chilling portrayal of her father. She saw the random killings, the terror, the brutality, and her entire world shattered. She broke down in tears. For the first time, she realized the full extent of her father's crimes, and it horrified her. Determined to make amends, Monika began researching everything about her father. She read survivor accounts, watched documentaries, and learned about the atrocities he committed. The more she uncovered, the more she felt ashamed and responsible. Then, she made a bold decision. She reached out to Helen Jonas, a Jewish woman who had been forced to work as Goth's personal maid. Helen had been just 15 years old when she was sent to Plaszow, and she had spent years in fear of being killed at any moment. Their meeting was tense, emotional, and painful. Monika apologized again and again, sobbing as she told Helen she couldn't believe she was his daughter. Their story was documented in the 2008 film Inheritance, a powerful look at the weight of a parent's sins. Unlike Gudrun Himmler and Etta Goring, Monika refused to live in denial. She spent years speaking out against Nazism, extremism, and Holocaust denial. She dedicated herself to education and awareness, warning people about the dangers of blind loyalty and hate. But no matter how much good she did, she struggled with guilt. She once said that even though she didn't commit her father's crimes, she would always carry the burden of being his daughter. But some actually believed their father had been a hero. For most of his childhood, Rolf Mengele believed his father was a war hero. Growing up in post-war Germany, he knew Josef Mengele only as a distant but caring parent, a man who sent him affectionate letters and words of advice. But at 12 years old, his world turned upside down. He discovered that his father wasn't just any doctor. He was Josef Mengele, the angel of death, the man who had performed brutal experiments on prisoners in Auschwitz, the man responsible for selecting thousands of innocent people to be sent to the gas chambers, the man whose name was spoken with fear and disgust across the world. The truth shattered Rolf. For years, he struggled to process it. How could the father who wrote him letters about school and life be the same man who had tortured children in a laboratory? He was desperate for answers but received nothing but silence from his family. Then, in 1977, he made a life-changing decision. He traveled to Brazil to confront his father in person. For the first time, Rolf and Josef Mengele sat face to face. Rolf demanded the truth. He asked what happened in Auschwitz. He wanted to know how his father could have done such things. Mengele's response? Complete denial. He refused to show any remorse. He insisted he had done nothing wrong, claiming he had been falsely accused and was a victim of history. For Rolf, it was soul-crushing. He had hoped to see regret, guilt, anything, but his father had no shame. Despite everything, Rolf didn't turn him in. He knew where his father was hiding. He could have alerted authorities and brought him to justice, but he stayed silent. 2 years later, in 1979, Josef Mengele died on a beach in Brazil, suffering a stroke while swimming. He had escaped trial, never once facing consequences for his crimes. Rolf lived with that guilt for the rest of his life. Eventually, he spoke publicly, admitting that he once believed in his father's innocence. He could no longer deny the truth. Overwhelmed by the weight of his past, he changed his last name, trying to escape the legacy he had inherited. But history doesn't forget so easily. Then there's the guy who decided to become a priest. Martin Bormann Jr. was born into power. His father, Martin Bormann Sr., was Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi Party. He controlled access to Hitler, oversaw party operations, and helped shape Germany's wartime policy. To Nazi leaders, Martin Jr. was special. He was given the nickname of Kronzi, short for Kronprinz or Crown Prince, because many believed he was being groomed for a future in the Reich. He was raised in absolute loyalty to Hitler. He attended elite Nazi schools where he was taught to worship the Führer. He was surrounded by propaganda, power, and privilege. Then, in 1945, everything collapsed. His father vanished as the war ended. Some believed he had died trying to escape Berlin. Others thought he fled to South America. No one knew for sure. At just 15 years old, Martin Jr. found himself orphaned and despised. He was taken in by Catholic priests who tried to reshape his worldview. He had spent his childhood believing Nazism was right, but now he was faced with undeniable proof of the horrors committed under Hitler's rule. It changed him forever. He rejected his father's beliefs, converted to Catholicism, and eventually became a priest. By 1958, he was officially ordained, dedicating his life to faith and service. But he didn't stop there. In the 1960s, he left Europe to become a missionary in the Congo, working to help the poor and disadvantaged. He had spent his early years surrounded by power and privilege, but now he was living among the world's most vulnerable people, trying to do some good in the world. For decades, he refused to defend or excuse his father's actions. He wanted to be judged for his own choices, not by the legacy of the Nazi elite. But no matter how far he ran, controversy found him. In 2011, former students came forward with disturbing allegations. They accused Martin Jr. of physical and sexual abuse during his time as a teacher at a Catholic boarding school. The accusations were serious, and though he was never convicted, they tarnished his reputation. For someone who had spent a lifetime trying to prove he was different from his father, the scandal was a devastating blow. Martin died in 2013, leaving behind a complicated legacy. He had tried to reject his past, had dedicated himself to faith and service, but in the end, he couldn't fully escape the shadow of his father's name. That's all for what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after World War II. If you're interested in more fascinating history content, make sure to click on the next video.